This is a LSD trip report by Baker, posted to arrowhead.org on April 21st, 2008. It was a cold Saturday night in late October. The sky was a thin sheet of cloud that reflected the streetlights in a dull silver glow. My friend Mark and I arrived at the house of another friend, Jamie, at exactly 10:30 in the evening. The three of us had planned this night for weeks. Jamie had never taken a psychedelic before, Mark had taken a few times, and I had taken many. I knew that the night would be a mixture of excitement, nervousness, and responsibility. I wanted the experience to be safe, enjoyable, and maybe a little enlightening for the two newcomers. We sat in the living room, a room with low-ceilinged windows, heavy curtains, and a small coffee table cluttered with snacks, a bottle of soda, and a few packs of cigarettes. The air smelled faintly of incense and the faint tang of old wood. The curtains were drawn halfway, leaving a thin strip of streetlight to cut across the room. The house was quiet, the only sound the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant bark of a dog. Jamie pulled out a small square of paper that had been folded many times. He placed it on the table, turned it over, and showed us the tiny blot of liquid that was his dose. He had taken a single 100 microgram tab of LSD. Mark had done the same. I had taken a tab of the same strength, but I added a microdot that contained about 10 micrograms. The extra microdot was something I used on rare occasions when I wanted a little extra edge, a little more clarity, a little more depth. I told Mark and Jamie about it, and they nodded. I reminded them that the extra microdot might make the trip feel a bit longer or a bit more intense, but that it would not change the overall character of the experience. We each placed the tab on our tongues, let it dissolve, and then swallowed the remaining saliva. The paper dissolved quickly, leaving a faint metallic taste. I felt a small shiver run down my spine as the chemical began to enter my bloodstream. I reminded Mark and Jamie that the onset of LSD is usually slow, that the first signs can be subtle, and that the most important thing is to stay calm and let the experience unfold naturally. The first half hour after ingestion passed without any obvious changes. The room remained the same, the curtains still hung, the light still filtered in the same way. I kept an eye on the clock. At 11 o'clock I felt the first hint of something shifting. The curtains, which had always been a flat piece of fabric, seemed to breathe ever so slightly, as if the fibers were expanding and contracting in time with an invisible pulse. The edges of the curtains appeared to be more defined, the folds more pronounced. I pointed this out to Mark and Jamie, saying, "Look at the curtains. They are breathing now. That is the first sign that the trip is beginning." Mark laughed and said he felt a little cold, as if a breeze had slipped through the room even though the windows were closed. He also said his hands felt numb, as if they were made of plastic. Jamie, who had been quiet, said he felt a little nausea in his stomach, a feeling that is common when LSD first begins to work. I told them that nausea was normal and that it would pass. I reminded them that the sensations they were feeling were not dangerous, just a sign that the chemical was moving through their bodies. At 11:15, the feeling of the curtains breathing became stronger. The fabric seemed to pulse in a slow, rhythmic way, like the beat of a heart. The colors of the curtains shifted ever so slightly, the reds becoming a bit more orange, the blues a touch more teal. The room felt a little warmer, even though the heating was off. I could feel my own heart rate increase, a gentle thudding that matched the rhythm of the curtains. I told Mark and Jamie to focus on their breathing, to let the breath be the anchor as the world around them changed. Around 11:30, Jamie said he was feeling a little cold again, but this time it was not just a feeling in his skin. It was as if the temperature of the air itself had dropped a few degrees. He described it as raw numbness that spread from my fingertips up my arms like a slow wave of cold water. Mark said his stomach had settled, but he now felt a lightness in his chest, as if a small balloon had been released inside him. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching myself from a slight distance. Yet at the same time I felt more present than ever before. At 12 midnight, we decided that the best way to continue would be to leave the house for a short walk. We wanted to see how the world outside would look under the influence. We put on our jackets, grabbed our shoes, and headed out into the quiet neighborhood. The street was dimly lit by street lamps that cast amber circles on the pavement. The houses were close together, each with its own small garden, a few dead leaves scattered on the lawns. A light drizzle had begun, and the rain made the asphalt glisten. We walked down the first block, the sound of our shoes splashing in the shallow puddles echoing softly. The rain seemed to fall in slow motion, each droplet hanging in the air for a fraction of a second before meeting the ground. The streetlights flickered, and their glow seemed to ripple across the wet pavement like a living thing. I felt the trip taking a firmer hold as we moved. The world around us was no longer a static backdrop. It was a living, breathing canvas. As we walked, I began to notice different sides of my friend's personalities emerging. Mark, who was usually very pragmatic and reserved, started to talk about his childhood dreams of becoming an astronaut. He described in vivid detail how he imagined floating among the stars, the earth a blue marble beneath him. Jamie, who was normally quiet and introspective, began to laugh loudly at a memory of a high school prank he had pulled. He described the feeling of the cold metal of a locker door as he slammed it shut, the echo reverberating down the hallway. I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the way the trip was opening up their inner worlds, allowing them to see themselves in new light. The neighborhood itself seemed to change as we walked. The houses appeared to be made of a different material, as if the brick had become a translucent crystal that let the interior lights glow like fireflies. The trees lining the street swayed gently, even though there was no wind. Their leaves were a deep, saturated green, each vein visible as a thin line of light. The rain, which had been a uniform sheet, now fell in distinct patterns, each droplet forming a tiny ripple that spread outward in concentric circles. It was as if the air itself was a pond, and each drop created a small wave. Mark complained that he was not seeing any patterns, that the world still looked normal. I tried to explain that the visual effects of LSD often start with subtle structural changes, like the breathing curtains, and that the more elaborate patterns often develop later. I told him that the experience is different for each person, and that the dose he had taken might be on the lower side for him, which could explain why his visuals were not as strong. Jamie nodded, still smiling, and said he felt a little buzz in his head, a feeling that something was shifting, even if he could not yet put it into words. We decided to stop at a small convenience store that was open late. The neon sign above the door flickered, casting a pinkish hue onto the wet sidewalk. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed, and the shelves were stocked with candy, chips, and a small selection of cigarettes. We bought a few packs of cigarettes, a bottle of water, and a bag of chips. While we waited in line, I could see the edges of the fluorescent tubes bending slightly, as if they were made of soft rubber. The colors of the candy on the shelves seemed to pulse in time with the music that was playing faintly over the store's speakers. After paying, we stepped back onto the street. The rain had stopped, leaving a thin mist that clung to the air. The streetlights now reflected off the wet pavement in a kaleidoscope of colors. I felt the trip moving into a new phase, a deeper immersion. The world felt alive, each surface humming with a quiet energy. We decided to smoke some weed at this point, thinking it would complement the LSD and perhaps bring us further into the visual realm. We found a quiet spot under a large oak tree near the corner of the block. The tree's branches stretched out like massive arms, and the leaves rustled gently in the night breeze. We lit the joint, inhaled, and exhaled a thick plume of smoke that curled into the cold air. The combination of the weed and the LSD seemed to shift the atmosphere dramatically. The colors around us became more saturated, the edges of objects softened, and the world seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. We sat there for a while, watching the streetlights dance on the wet pavement. The smoke seemed to form shapes that moved in slow, deliberate patterns, like small spirits drifting through the air. My friends began to talk about television shows they had watched as children, about video games they used to play. Their conversation was light, almost childish, and I could see that they were trying to ground themselves in familiar things, perhaps to keep the experience from becoming overwhelming. I reminded myself that LSD offers an opportunity to simply be, to accept whatever arises without judgment. I tried to stay present, to let the images flow, and to observe the way my mind was opening. After a short while, we returned to Jamie's house. The door opened into a warm, dimly lit hallway. The walls were lined with family photographs, each frame catching the light in a slightly different way. I could see the grain of the wood floor, each board distinct, as if the texture had been amplified. We collected some warm jackets and scarves, preparing for another walk up a steep hill that lay behind the house. The hill was a familiar place for us, a place where we used to go as children to watch the sunrise. Tonight, however, it would be a place where we would explore the inner landscape as well. As we started the ascent, Mark began to fall into a mental loop. He was worried about a small bag of weed that we had hidden earlier. He imagined that someone might find it, that he might forget where he had placed it, that he might be forced to give it away, and that someone might steal it from him. His thoughts spiraled, each worry feeding the next. Jamie, on the other hand, was fixated on reaching a different house that he believed we needed to get to. He kept saying, "We have to get there," as if the destination were the only thing that mattered. I tried to remind them that the journey itself was the point, that the moment we were in was enough, that the hill, the rain, the streetlights, the breath in our lungs were all part of the experience. Their voices grew louder, their breathing faster, as the hill grew steeper. I could feel the tension in my own body, a mixture of concern for my friends and a deep curiosity about how the trip would unfold. I kept telling them to let go of the need to reach any particular place, to simply be present with the sensations. My own mind was beginning to settle into a calm observation, a quiet acceptance of whatever images or thoughts arrived. At around 1:45 in the morning, Mark and Jamie both reached for the small bottle of Valium that we had kept as a safety measure. Each took a 5 mg tablet, hoping to smooth the around 1:45 in the morning. Mark and Jamie both reached for the small bottle of Valium that we had kept as a safety measure. Each took a 5 mg tablet, hoping to smooth the edge that was beginning to sharpen around their thoughts. I watched the tablets dissolve in their mouths, the faint white specks disappearing as they swallowed. Within a few minutes, a softening spread through their bodies, a gentle heaviness that seemed to pull the tension away from their shoulders. Their breathing slowed, and the frantic pace of their inner dialogue began to quiet. The hill we had been climbing felt suddenly less steep. The streetlights that had flickered in the distance now glowed with a steady, warm light. The rain that had begun to fall earlier turned into a fine mist that settled on my skin, each drop feeling like a tiny pulse. I felt the world settle into a slower rhythm, as if the whole night had taken a breath and was holding it. With the Valium taking effect, Mark and Jamie fell into a quiet stillness. Their eyes closed, their hands rested on their knees, and they seemed to sink into the earth beneath them. I stayed upright, feeling the residual tremor of the LSD still moving through my veins. The combination of the drug and the quiet of the night created a space where I could watch my own mind without the usual chatter. I began to notice the way the rain changed the texture of the pavement. Each stone seemed to have a thin film of water that reflected the light in tiny, moving patterns. The patterns were not random, they repeated in a way that reminded me of a simple loop. As I stared, the loops grew larger, then smaller, folding back on themselves. It was as if the ground itself was breathing, expanding, and contracting with each breath I took. The feeling of my heart beating in my chest grew louder, not in a frightening way, but as a clear, steady drum. I could feel the blood moving through my veins, the way it pushed against the walls of my arteries. The sensation was both grounding and expansive. I felt my feet firmly planted on the wet grass, yet at the same time I sensed a pull toward the sky, as if I could lift off the ground at any moment. The peak of the experience arrived not with a sudden explosion, but with a slow widening of awareness. The world around me seemed to open like a window that had been cracked just enough to let in a bright light. Colors became more vivid, but not in a garish way. The green of the grass was deeper, the blue of the night sky richer. The streetlights cast halos that seemed to ripple outward, each halo a thin ring that faded into the darkness. I felt a sense of connection to everything that was present. The rain, the streetlights, the distant hum of a car passing on a far road, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. All of these sounds blended into a single low hum. It was not a noise, but a feeling that something larger was present, something that held all the small parts together. I did not try to label it. I simply let it be. My thoughts moved quickly at first, like a stream rushing over rocks. I saw images of fractal patterns, spirals that repeated at different scales. I imagined a tiny seed growing into a tree, the branches splitting into smaller branches, each branch splitting again. The same pattern appeared in the clouds above, in the way the rain fell, in the way my own thoughts branched. I could not separate the image from the feeling. They were one. As the peak settled into a plateau, the intensity of the visuals softened, but the sense of clarity remained. I found myself sitting on the hill, legs crossed, watching the rain fall. I felt an urge to move, to run down the hill, to feel the ground under my feet. I stood, took a deep breath, and began to run. My body responded with a speed and agility that felt almost animalistic. My legs moved in a smooth rhythm, my arms swung naturally, and I felt the wind against my face as I descended. Running down the hill felt like a dance with the earth. Each step was precise, each movement purposeful. I could hear the sound of my own breath, the thud of my feet hitting the wet grass, the distant echo of my friend's quiet breathing. The world seemed to narrow to the sensation of motion. I felt alive in a way that was both simple and profound. The rush of adrenaline mixed with the lingering effects of the LSD created a feeling of being completely present. When I reached the bottom of the hill, I stopped abruptly. My heart was pounding, my muscles were warm, and my mind was still filled with the images of spirals and loops. I turned back toward the house, where Mark and Jamie were sitting, eyes closed, breathing slowly. Their faces were relaxed, the tension gone. I could see the faint outline of the Valium's effect on their expressions. They seemed to be floating just above the ground, detached from the physical world, but still present. I sat down beside them, and we shared a moment of silence. The rain continued to fall, each drop sounding like a tiny tap on the roof. I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me, not just for the experience, but for the safety that we had prepared, for the trust we had in each other, for the simple fact that we were alive in that moment. The plateau lasted for what felt like an hour, though the clock would later tell me it was closer to 2. During that time, my thoughts drifted from the fractal images to more practical concerns. I thought about my upcoming university applications, about the job I had been considering, about the relationship I had with my sister. Each thought was examined without judgment, as if I were watching a movie of my own life. The usual anxiety that accompanied those thoughts was muted, replaced by a calm curiosity. At some point, the rain began to ease, the mist thinning into a light drizzle. The streetlights flickered less, their halos becoming steadier. The world seemed to settle back into a normal rhythm, but the memory of the peak lingered like a faint afterglow. I felt a gentle pull toward the house, a desire to return to the warmth of the interior, to sit with my friends and share what we had seen. We entered the house, shook off the dampness, and wrapped ourselves in warm blankets. The air inside was thick with the scent of incense we had lit earlier, a sweet, earthy smell that seemed to ground us. We lit a joint, the smoke curling upward in slow, lazy spirals that reminded me of the patterns I had seen earlier. The weed added a layer of relaxation that complemented the lingering LSD, smoothing the edges of the experience further. As the smoke filled the room, my mind drifted back to the fractal theory that had taken hold during the peak. I imagined the universe as a single cell, each part of it reflecting the whole. I thought about how each thought I had was a tiny version of a larger pattern, how each decision I made was a branch of a larger tree. The idea felt both simple and complex, like a child's drawing that somehow captured the essence of a whole forest. The come-down began gradually. The vivid colors softened, the sharpness of the visuals faded, and the sense of unity began to dissolve into ordinary perception. My body felt heavy, as if the weight of the night had settled onto my limbs. My eyes, which had been bright and wide, now felt a little gritty from the rain and the smoke. I yawned, a deep, satisfying stretch that seemed to release the last of the tension. Mark opened his eyes first, blinking slowly. He looked around, as if seeing the room for the first time. Jamie followed, his gaze lingering on the ceiling where a small crack of light from the street shone through. We all laughed, a soft, shared sound that seemed to echo the relief we felt. The laughter was not forced. It was a natural response to the end of a long, intense journey. The after effects lingered for several hours. My mind continued to replay the fractal images, but now they appeared as faint sketches rather than vivid scenes. My body felt a gentle soreness in my calves, the result of the run down the hill. My throat was a little dry from the weed and the rain, and I reached for a glass of water, feeling the cool liquid travel down my throat and settle in my chest. I noticed that my appetite had returned. The taste of the water was sharp, and I could feel the subtle sweetness of the incense lingering on my tongue. I made a sandwich, the bread soft and warm, the cheese melting slightly. Each bite felt rich, as if I were tasting it for the first time. The simple act of eating grounded me, pulling me back into the ordinary flow of life. As the night turned toward morning, the rain stopped completely. The sky lightened, a pale gray that hinted at the coming sunrise. I stepped outside again, feeling the cool grass under my bare feet. The world was quiet, the street empty, the streetlights now dimmer. I stood there for a few moments, watching the first hints of light creep across the horizon. The reflection phase began as the sun rose. I thought about the moments that had stood out most clearly. The first was the feeling of the hill becoming less steep after the Valium took effect. That moment showed me how a small adjustment could change the entire trajectory of an experience. The second was the run down the hill, where my body seemed to move with a purpose that was both instinctual and aware. That reminded me that my body still knows how to act even when my mind is filled with abstract ideas. The third was the fractal pattern that kept appearing, not only in the visuals but in the way my thoughts repeated. I realized that I had been caught in loops before, in arguments with friends, and habits that felt repetitive. The acid had taken those loops and laid them out in a visual form, allowing me to see them clearly. I saw that the loops were not necessarily bad. They were part of how the mind organizes experience. The key was to notice when a loop became a trap and to step out of it. I also reflected on the role of the Valium. It had taken the edge off the anxiety that was building in Mark and Jamie, allowing them to settle. It had also given me a chance to observe the peak without being pulled into panic. I thought about safety measures and the importance of having a plan, especially when guiding others who are new to this kind of experience. The preparation we had done, having a safe space, having water, having a calming medication, proved essential. The after effects on my mood were noticeable. I felt a lingering sense of calm, a quiet contentment that stayed with me throughout the day. I found myself smiling at small things. The way the sunlight hit the window, the sound of a bird calling from a nearby tree, the taste of coffee when I finally made a cup later that morning. The intensity of the trip had faded, but the insights it provided remained. I spent the rest of the day writing notes, trying to capture the ideas that had arisen. I wrote down the fractal theory, the sense of being part of a larger pattern, the observation that time felt less like a line and more like a series of overlapping circles. I also wrote down practical things, the need to schedule a follow-up conversation with Mark and Jamie to check in on how they felt after the night, to discuss any lingering thoughts they might have. Later in the afternoon, I called my sister. I told her about the night in a straightforward way, avoiding dramatic language. I mentioned the run down the hill, the way the rain felt, the thoughts about loops. She listened, asked a few questions, and then said she was glad I was safe. The conversation reminded me that the insights from a psychedelic experience are most useful when they are shared in a calm, ordinary context. In the evening, I prepared a simple dinner and invited Mark and Jamie over. They arrived looking rested, their faces calm. We ate together, the food warm and comforting. We talked about the night, each of us describing what we remembered. Mark spoke about the feeling of his body becoming heavy, about how the Valium made his thoughts feel like they were floating. Jamie talked about the fear he had felt before taking the tablet, and how it dissolved into a quiet acceptance. I shared the fractal images, the sense of being part of something larger, and the way the run down the hill had felt like a release of built-up energy. We all agreed that the night had been a mixture of challenge and beauty. We recognized that the challenging parts, paranoia, loops, the urge to reach a destination, were part of the experience, not something to be avoided.